What are we talking about right now? We're talking about logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are one of my favorite things, and I think students find them to be their favorite areas of study in rhetoric because you start to see them everywhere once you start to study logical fallacies. You have a list of them, and this comes from Valencia College. It's a really nice handout, and I just thought it summarized it really well that I didn't want to recreate it. I have a sheet that offers these and even more that I'm going to offer you, but I'll give you both resources. But for this overview, I'm just going to talk about the ones that are on Valencia College's logical fallacies sheet here. So the thing you need to understand about logical fallacies first is they appear to be logical based on the logos constructs that you've studied so far. But the problem is they're actually not, and they have a failure of logic within them. And if you don't recognize them, they're actually really effective. And so that's the first thing I want you to understand is logical fallacies aren't bad. They sound bad. They sound like they're things you want to avoid. And that's true if you're trying to make a logical sound argument. But it's not true if your job is simply to convince an audience. For instance, we'll watch the debates, the political debates, and you're going to see a ton of logical fallacies. And if you just listen to arguments with your friends or with your family, you're going to hear a ton of logical fallacies. Just because it's a nature of individuals to utilize them because of how well they work. And they're pretty convincing. And they sound logical, and if you don't know it, you might sit there and be like, oh, that was a great point. Even though it wasn't. It was actually totally wrong. It's totally illogical. So let's dive into them. Our first one, maybe I'll move over a little bit here, so that I can put it right here. Ooh, I'm loving this move. The first one on the list from Valencia College is faulty cause and effect. Faulty cause and effect happens often, and you see it in crime shows a lot, I feel like. And what it basically is saying is, just because A happened and then B happened at the same time does not mean A caused B or A was responsible for B. So an example would be something like, let's say a student is in the hallway and then there's a loud boom in the hallway. And I go out into the hallway and I see that student and I see a locker on the ground. It would be false cause and effect for me to say, student, that was you who knocked the locker over and therefore you are in trouble. It doesn't mean they weren't that person. It's just illogical for me to say it was absolutely that, because just because time connects two things doesn't make it a cause and effect. Just because it happens at the same time, it does not result in it being a logical cause and effect. Okay. The next one, non-sequitur, which is fantastic. Non-sequiturs, the conclusion being not necessarily a logical result of the facts. So for instance, you hear this a lot in English teaching. If someone's like, oh, well that person's a great writer, they'd be a phenomenal English teacher. That's not necessarily true. Just because you're a good writer doesn't make you a good English teacher. What makes you a good English teacher is so many other factors that go into that. Okay, the next one on their list is begging the question, and this fallacy presents a truth, something that is supposed to be proven by argument. So, this fallacy presents as truth, something that is supposed to be proven by argument. Their example here is great, so I'm just going to use that. And their example is all hunting is inhumane and should be outlawed. Now again, if you're speaking to an audience that doesn't like hunting or doesn't like guns or doesn't like violence, something like that, they might just agree with you and be like, oh, absolutely. But the critical mind is going to say, well, that's not necessarily true. Sometimes you might hunt because there's overpopulation of a species, and if you have too much of a population of a species, that can disrupt the ecosystem. Now, why that overpopulation happened is a different topic, but it doesn't necessarily make the hunting inhumane. And therefore, a reasoned mind would say, that's not necessarily true, that all hunting is inhumane and therefore should be outlawed. So that's a begging the question. The next one, circular logic, is a great one. You hear this all the time when people try to justify things, and they'll use basically the premise as the reason. The example here, there aren't enough parking spaces on campus because there are too many cars. The English paper is very difficult because it's challenging. These kind of things where it's basically the same premise as rationale, that's circular logic. Hasty generalization is simply saying that something is broadly true because you've heard maybe one or two pieces of evidence related to that. And so you'll notice there's a nice deductive logic going on there, starting from specific and going to broad, but it's not necessarily true. And that's where you can end up with a hasty generalization. So for instance, if I have met two students at your school and I didn't like either of those students, you might say I wouldn't like anyone at your school. Well, that's not fair. That's a hasty generalization. And we see this all the time, especially as we're going through school. You see this kind of logic go on again and again and again. Sometimes you'll see it come up as anecdotal evidence, where one story somehow sets up a generalization for a whole group of individuals or a whole thing. This is the same as like a stereotype oftentimes, where we broadly categorize someone or a group into something because of limited information. The next one is the either or fallacy, and that sounds like what it is. It's just saying something is either this or that. So he is either a good teacher or a bad teacher. She is a good writer or a bad writer. Most of the time, it's not an either or. Sometimes it is, sometimes, it's just a good vest or a bad vest. And this one happens to be a good vest. But oftentimes, there's not that same level of black or white, right? That polar opposite. Okay, a faulty analogy is simply when someone gives an analogy that isn't functional, okay? It doesn't work. So in an analogy, you need to be drawing two things together so that people understand it better. But in a faulty analogy, you're drawing two things that really don't work. It makes for a way that people don't understand it. So for instance, here, the example says, if the state can require car seats for small children and infants, then they can just as easily require mothers to breastfeed instead of using formula. That's not a true analogy. That doesn't work. Okay. Right now in COVID, I just saw on the news there was an example of a woman said, well, I shouldn't have to wear a mask because bank robbers wear masks and they're criminals and I'm not a criminal. And that's a faulty analogy. You're not a criminal just because you wear a mask, so it doesn't follow. It doesn't work. But you could understand how it could be manipulative if, again, typically there's a more sympathetic audience or a group that's easily engaged in your argument, and they want to follow you because they agree to what you're trying to argue, even though it's totally wrong. It's totally a faulty analogy. Number 8, argument to the man ad hominem. This is simply where, and you'll see this a lot in debates, when someone's losing a debate, they will just attack the other person. So, and it won't always be personal. It won't always be about their personality or their likes or their interest or who they are or their looks or anything like that. Sometimes it'll be about actions they've done in the past, but it's clearly irrelevant to what they're doing. And so they're just attacking their person and trying to tear down that person rather than the topic that they're discussing. But a lot of the times it's just going to be nasty comments toward a person, trying to make it seem logical, but you're just trying to attack that person. Bandwagon appeal is when you try to draw everyone in on an argument. So if you said something like, everyone's eating a vegan patty on their burgers, therefore we should eat vegan patties on our burgers. Now, it might be good to eat vegan patties, the Impossible Burger or something like that, but just because everyone's doing it doesn't mean you should do it. You might have heard your parents say this at some point, where if everyone's going to, jump off a bridge, are you going to do that? And you roll your eyes and say, no, I'm not, but I still want to go out and do this thing, right? But they're trying to use that argument and say, don't jump on the bandwagon. A red herring, you'll hear these oftentimes in arguments. Red herrings are really clever. They work in debates really well. And a red herring is effectively when someone tries to distract from the point by bringing up a different point, sometimes of more substance, but it has nothing to do with the point being argued. So let's say you're arguing fervently about how we should get rid of homework in school, and then someone says, you know, homework's really important, but I'm also really worried about the water quality in our drinking fountains. And if you can distract enough, and that one's kind of ridiculous, right? But if you can distract enough, it can get the argument off track and distract from that central argument. Usually it'll be more subtle. So if let's say you're arguing about homework and you're arguing specifically about the amount of time related to homework, then someone might veer that off though and say, time is a personal choice and you have control over the time you spend. And so they start to veer it away from the focus that you want, which is that the institution is mandating a certain amount of time. Last one, and this was a new one for me, so I apologize if I say it wrong, but this is the new one we're adding this year. I just really like it, but it's hypostatization, which I've seen this one a lot. I'll say that again, hypostatization. And that's where the writer uses an abstract concept as if it were concrete reality. You see this all the time, and the examples here are great. Science shows us that improved quality of life comes through research and invention. There's nothing specific there. It's super abstract, but it sounds like it's absolute truth. Or historians agree that studying the past is the best way to avoid repeating mistakes. What are you talking about? It's so vague that it doesn't actually establish that argument, and therefore it's a logical fallacy. That's 12. Okay, there's 12 logical fallacies there. That's good to get started. I'm also going to add a few onto a sheet that you'll see. It'll look very similar to this one because I just really like how this is laid out. So again, big thanks to the fine folks at Valencia College for their really nice breakdown here. You'll get an opportunity to look at this exact sheet, and I think it's just a really nice overview of what these are. We'll practice these, and hopefully it will help you understand them and start to recognize them in the world around you.